That is a highly controversial topic.
It's not quite moral, but it is a theological explanation.
The idea of like apocalyptic literature is not that it's to be interpreted in necessarily a literal sense.
Yeah, I'm impressed by your very thorough research.
I just started thinking about this because, as you might imagine, nobody's ever asked me in church about Judas.
That's a fascinating philosophical discussion.
I think it's important to talk to them and find out what they believe. Hello everyone, this episode is brought to you by that $20 bill I found. Thank you, careless person. Also, thanks to those who are helping out on Patreon. The links are here and down below in the thingy. I hope you enjoy our interview with Rabbi Tovia Singer, where we talk about Job's dead family, rouge-colored cattle, and whether people who convert to Judaism were really Jewish the whole time. Make sure you stick around for the end, where I tell you two things you probably didn't know. And if you happen to see me on Twitch, please send me an email and let me know how that happened, because I'm not on Twitch. Hello and welcome to the What They Believe series. Today my guest is Rabbi Tovia Singer of Judaism Outreach, a counter-missionary organization based out of Israel. Thank you for joining us, Rabbi.
Thank you for having me on.
I know that you were born in the United States and spent some time in Indonesia and now have settled in Israel. I suppose the first question is, what compelled you to become a rabbi?
My father's a rabbi, my grandfather's a rabbi, and you know the rest of it. So it was part of our family, and in my world, most of the young men went to rabbinical school, but very quickly I knew that I wanted to help Jews in the church return back to the Jewish faith. But becoming a rabbi is fairly normative in Orthodox circles, meaning not all, not most, but a very significant number of young men will just go to rabbinical school following high school. So that's very normal. What is unusual is my effort to help Jews who've become Christians. Take the example of the person you had on who's Messianic. So these people are Christians, but they deliberately call themselves Messianic Jews. For what purpose? After all, everything they believe in is thoroughly Christian. It's in order to blur the distinctions between Judaism and Christianity in order to lure Jews who would otherwise resist the straightforward Christian message. So evangelical Christians, and that's not liberal Christians, not mainline Christians, but fundamentalist evangelical Christians are very much targeting Jewish people for conversion. They believe that Jesus can't make a second coming unless the Jews are converted to Christianity. And after all, more than half of the Jews in the world live in Israel. So as you can imagine, this is a hotbed of evangelism right here in the Holy Land. I was in Indonesia to help Jews who had converted to Christianity there, to help them return back to the Jewish faith. As it turns out, Indonesia was very friendly to me because it's a Muslim country and Muslims happen to have a high regard for the Jewish faith. So they respected me, and it was a very good relationship with the Islamic community.
All right, this next question I thought would have been an easy one to answer. However, the comment section on my series disagrees. The question would be, what makes somebody Jewish? I'm going to break that into smaller parts. First, I'd like to ask about patrilineal versus matrilineal lineage. In the Bible, I could see that there are several examples of patrilineal Judaism, yet today it's commonly accepted that it's a matrilineal lineage. Can you expand more about that?
The Jewish people are essentially the only ethno-religious group in the world. We're unique in more ways than most people think, which means we're a nation. We're part of a nation that traces itself back to biblical times. I'm a great-grandson of Aaron, the brother of Moses. Right, so he's the brother of Moses, and I'm his great-great-grandson, father, son, and I'm a priest, therefore. So we're a nation, we're a physical, and we're also a faith. That's very unusual. It's unheard of. Okay. So as it turns out, Jewish identity is only conveyed through the mother, and that's the case in the Bible as well. It's never changed. For example, when Ezra returns back to the land of Israel in chapter 10, and he discovers that more than 100 Jewish men took non-Jewish women and had children with them, he told them that you can't remain with these women or these children. However, while being Jewish is conveyed exclusively through the mother, matrilineal line, tribe identity is conveyed only through a patrilineal descent. So there are actually two streams. You know you're Jewish through your mother, and that goes all the way back to the Bible. You can find that in Deuteronomy chapter 13, for example. If your brother only who's the son of your mother, not the son of your father. However, in Numbers chapter 1, we're told that the way you know what tribe you're from is in Hebrew, lemishpachosam, leves havosam, according to your family, according to your father's house. So I'm Jewish because my mother is Jewish. And one of the very important things about Judaism is that we don't change. We're unchanging. So the idea that Judaism evolved or we change the rules at some point, that's completely antithetical to the Jewish faith. We just don't change. We don't alter. But I happen to be a priest, which means I'm a great-grandson of Aaron, the brother of Moses. Moses is my uncle. So therefore, I'm also a Kohen, which is the Hebrew word for a priest. So I'm Jewish because of my mother, and I'm a member of the tribe of Levi and descendant of Aaron because of my father.
Does that work the same for converts? If someone were to convert to Judaism, would their children be automatically Jewish as well? I've always said that I could, say, move to Portugal and even become a Portuguese citizen, but that wouldn't necessarily make me Portuguese. So does it work the same for converts?
A person can convert to Judaism. However, there's a caveat, and that is if someone does convert to Judaism, we view that as that they essentially were always Jewish. They always had a Jewish soul, and they're sort of returning back from a strange place. In fact, the name for a convert is called a ger. That's the Hebrew word. And the word ger doesn't really mean a convert at all. Rather, it means a stranger, someone who was simply raised in a non-Jewish world. Like, let's say for you, right? Let's say if you did the research and you discovered that your great-great-grandmother, matrilineal descent, was Jewish after all. I mean, you're not a Native American. At some point, you came from Europe, from Asia, from Russia. You're not a Native American Indian. So it's very possible that your great-great-grandparents actually fled persecution, identified as a Christian in order to escape Hitler's ovens or whatever, and a pogrom, and then your Jewish identity was lost. People like that typically would be drawn to converting to Judaism.
You said that the rules don't change. Is that accurate? I'm not an expert on Israel, but I don't think that they kill people for working on the Sabbath or stone unruly children. Obviously, those rules aren't being enforced in the same way, and I've spoken to a lot of other Jewish sects that don't necessarily adhere to the rules as strictly as some of the other sects would. So, would those sects still be Jewish as well?
Yes, they would be considered Jewish. I mean, Christopher Hitchens is considered a Jewish person. Sam Harris, a noted atheist, is regarded as Jewish in Jewish law. They're not practicing Judaism, but both of them share this striking feature, and that is their mothers are Jewish. And there are many other people who are famed atheists who are Jewish, even though they're not practicing or believing. Because remember what I shared with you earlier, we're an ethno-religious group, but you have people who decide personally that they don't want to be a part of the nation, or they don't want to observe the mitzvot, they're free to do that. As far as death penalty goes, the reason we're not carrying out the death penalty is not because the rules have changed, but as it turns out, in the Bible, you need a very special circumstance in order to actually have a capital punishment. You have to have a proper court. There has to be just a whole series of circumstances have to be in place. Even during temple times, when there was a Sanhedrin, when there was a court, the level of evidence required and witnesses the bar is so high that it was nearly impossible to ever carry out the death penalty. And it was designed that way because we didn't really want to put anyone to death, but we wanted to send the message that cigarette smoking kills. So when federal agencies in the United States force tobacco companies to put on their packaging smoking kills, and they have to by law, they're not doing that because they want you to die. They're doing that because they want you to stop smoking. So in theory, sure, someone can be put to death. But what the Bible also does, Deuteronomy 17, also does is creates a bar that's so high that makes it almost impossible for anyone to actually be executed. A court system in Israel during temple times that put more than one person to death in 70 years was considered a killer court. It was almost impossible to happen. So it's a brilliant design. We want you to know that what you're smoking may not seem like a problem to you, and you might enjoy a few shots of whiskey every day, but we want you to know this stuff is going to kill you in the long run. So it sends the message, but it's not really carried out. Judaism is very much about not changing anything.
Over the course of this series, I've spoken to several rabbis, Renewal, Reform, Hasidic, but you're the first Orthodox rabbi I've ever spoken to. What would you say separates Orthodox Judaism from the other types of Judaism?
First of all, the other sects of Judaism are modern innovations. They're very, very young. Humanist Judaism, it emerges in the last century. The conservative movement, which has like the weirdest label ever was, because they're anything but conservative, I'm not trying to be disparaging, but it was invented a little bit more than a century ago. The Reform movement was only a couple of centuries old. Orthodox Judaism is what's unchanging, but because of dramatic changes that occurred in the 17th century following the 30-Year War, Enlightenment, there was just a push, not just within the Jewish tradition, but in the Christian tradition for a rethinking, a re-examination. I mean, Spinoza didn't just come out of nowhere, 8 million people dead following the bloodiest religious war in human history, had an enormous impact on the way people thought about religion. And so this Enlightenment put pressure on tradition, and there was a split apart. And the Reform movement was simply swept away. Now, this is much more complicated than I'm representing it. The Reform movement was also seeking for a way out of anti-Semitism. Like, why do they hate us? So they thought of themselves, we're a religion, but we're not a nation. That's much more complicated for this show. But the point is that these accretions of Judaism, these sects of Judaism, are modern innovations. The Reform movement in the late 19th century gathered in Pittsburgh and essentially voted on what they believe and don't believe. So it's not like they're the Reform movement or humanist, or they're not the Church of the Latter-day Saints. They're not claiming that they have a prophet like Joseph Smith in upstate New York that told them you should be a Reform Jew, a conservative. They're just a product of an Enlightenment. So the Reform movement moved away from tradition in some way. I'm not trying to offend your Reform viewers, but that's just what happened. The conservative movement was a reaction to that. It was reactionary, saying, whoa, you went too far, fellow. So you have these movements emerging after the Enlightenment. And what Orthodox Judaism is simply, we just haven't changed at all. We just, it's always, means there's no difference in my practice and the practice of a Jew who lived 2,000 years ago. I mean, my clothing is European. You know, the kind of music I enjoy is probably different than the prophets, but my practice is identical. My beliefs are identical. And any Orthodox Jew in the world believes exactly the same thing on doctrine, not necessarily on the application of political issues, who to vote for. That's not doctrine. But as far as what we believe, we all believe the exact same thing.
When it comes to Christians trying to convert Jews to Christianity, I also find that slightly off-putting. I know personally people have been trying to convert me. I'm not Jewish, but several of the interviews I've gotten with Christian pastors, they specifically stated that they were granting the interview because they thought that it would cause me to see the light and perhaps become a, let's say, Southern Baptist. There are groups, specifically I know one in Texas, that is trying to breed the red heifer, the one that needs to be sacrificed in order for the third temple to be built. How do you feel about Christians using Judaism in that way, specifically since they were trying to force prophecy?
Well, they're not trying to force prophecy. They're trying to make something accessible that would be needed in the Messianic age. So we have to just, this is going to sound very weird to your viewers unless I provide some background to the para aduma, the red heifer. So there is an impurity called tuma in Hebrew that could set in if life is lost. So because a human being is created in the image of God, when a human being dies, so the body becomes tuma, impure. It doesn't mean impure in a conventional sense, as in unclean or dirty or filthy, none of those things. But the vacuum that was triggered by the soul leaving the body creates an impurity. Now, if a person comes to contact with the dead, which is not a sin, on the contrary, burying someone is a very good thing. It's called a mitzvah. It's really a good thing to do. However, that person, once in contact with the dead, cannot bring offerings in the temple. There is a chok, a very unusual commandment, and that is that the ashes from a perfectly red heifer that's slaughtered properly is used in order to purify someone only from that sort of tuma, that kind of contamination. Now, we don't have a temple today. There's no temple, right? So there's no need for a red heifer now, because I've been to the Temple Mount. There's no temple there. So, but in the Messianic age, there will be a temple, and the sacrificial system, as described in Ezekiel 40 through 48, will resume in its full course. And therefore, at that moment, people we're all come into contact with the dead by one way or another, have to become pure. So the red heifer will have to resume. Now, imagine finding a heifer, a cow, that's every hair is red, right? So you may have seen red heifers, I have. I mean, just seen them in the wild. But when you get a close look, you notice that there are a few hairs that are off. So finding one that's perfect, that's bred and is perfect, is something in preparation, not for something happening today, but the Messianic age is, we don't know, but it's very possibly would happen soon. If it would have to be accessible. So there's an effort going on in the United States, in Switzerland, to breed such animals.
Geopolitics aside, and I do believe that geopolitically it would be disastrous, but do you think that construction of a third temple would be a worthy endeavor?
It's not worthy, it's just everyone will want it. Remember, the key feature of the Messianic age is everyone, the knowledge of God will cover the world as the water covers the sea. Isaiah 11, verse 9. The most important striking feature of the Messianic age is we will not have differences of religion. There won't be any atheists, and I know you're not going to be offended by saying that, but the whole world will be of one accord. And that's why war will come to an end. That's why there'll be peace in the world. Everyone will know about God. So everyone is going to just want a temple in Jerusalem. It's not that we're going to force anybody. Everyone will be very delighted about the temple because it'll be a time of peace. So you can't take our current. I think there's something like 27 wars raging in the world right now. 2 of them or 3 of them we're all very familiar with. What's going on in Israel, what's going on in Yemen, what's going on in Ukraine. There's actually many other wars going on around the world. All that is going to come to an end, and the whole world will be of one accord on the God issue. So at that point, everyone is going to want a temple in Jerusalem. So you have to put the horse in front of the cart. It's not that anyone's going to be forced to do anything. Everyone is going to want a temple in Jerusalem.
I was listening to a preacher recently in Texas, 2 Texas in a row. I'm not picking on Texas, it's just lined up that way. But he invoked the curse of Ham, or Ham, I believe it might be pronounced. To summarize that story, Noah gets very drunk in his tent and passes out with his robe open, and he's not wearing any undergarments. His son comes in and sees what's going on. He leaves, gets his other brothers, and his other brothers walk into the tent backwards and cover up Noah. When Noah finally awakens, he knows what his son has done, and as punishment, he sells his grandson into slavery. This has often been used by racists as a justification for the subjugation of darker-skinned people. I'd like to know your thoughts on the curse of Ham.
Yeah, so this is very intriguing. So imagine for a moment if you walked into a room and your father was completely undressed, right? I'm just saying this rhetorically. I presume you'd be very uncomfortable. And the first thing that would come to mind is you would cover your dad up or cover any parent up, because they're not in the appropriate position, right? So Chum did not show that respect for his father that he should have. His brothers, on the other hand, covered up their father, did the appropriate thing. We have to settle the slavery issue, because if we don't, then this will make no sense, because there's like an elephant in the room. Slavery in Judaism was a very good thing. I'll have to explain that. That is not slavery as a black man in Alabama in 1820. That's horrible. That's sin. And you're quite right. That the slave trade was fueled by weaponizing the Bible and saying that the Bible advocates for it. And you're quite correct. That's considered a sin. In the ancient world, in Judaism, not in other cultures, when you became a servant in someone's house, that means you joined that family. I know nothing about you, but let's say for whatever reason you didn't have a family to care for you and you were in the ancient world. You couldn't just get a job and get a house. You needed a family to protect you. The family need to be extended to a clan and to a tribe. The only protection you had was your family. But what happens if you didn't have a family for whatever reason? You can't call the police. You couldn't call the FBI. You didn't have that in the ancient world. So what did you do? Well, you can go to a Jewish family and say, I want to be an Eved, which is the Hebrew word, and which means I am joining a family. And by joining the family, I am gaining the protection of the family, but also the responsibilities of the family. In turn, the family, which is now extended beyond the biological family, would guide you in how you should live your life. In Genesis 15, when Abraham is told by God that he's going to have a child, he's going to have descendants, a covenant. Abraham at the time was childless, and he thought, you must mean my servant. In Hebrew, it's the same word, slave, Eved. And God said, no, it's got to be someone from your loins. So a slave in the Bible does not mean a bad thing. It means you're joining a family. And just like, you learn a lot from your dad and from your uncles. And we don't know each other, but maybe you have an uncle or an aunt or a grandparent that was like the most influential person in your life. So so therefore, Chum is not cursed. In fact, the word is arur. There are two Hebrew words for the word curse, and that's why the Hebrew language is so important to us. So arur has the same root as the word or, which means light. So because Chum did not display inappropriate behavior, what does he need more? What does his descendants need more than anything? They need another family which they can cling to so they can appreciate and absorb appropriate behavior. So slave means something else in Judaism than it does in 19th century America. And curse, there are two words for curse in Hebrew. That's why Orthodox Jews teach their children Hebrew. That's like we can read Hebrew like a newspaper. I mean, it's just we're taught that right away. So there's that kind is not a curse. It means that from this challenge, from this difficulty of having to have children in pain, and conceive in pain, you then are forced to turn to God and pray to God, which makes you a better person. So it's a different kind of curse. The English translation has no equivalent. So therefore, it never works in the translation. You're stuck with Genesis 9 in an English translation, and there is nothing in the English vocabulary that properly conveys the word arur. But it really means we're going to put you in a predicament so that you're going to have to become enlightened and to become a better person. And being a servant in someone else's house, in this case, Shem or Yefeth, will then improve your predicament, the predicament of Canaan and his descendants.
Okay, this is either a very, very easy question for you to answer or very difficult. Do you have a favorite passage from Scripture?
I think that the opening of Song of Songs, where we have a conversation between God's people and the Almighty, and it's a beautiful work written by King Solomon, so it's 3,000 years old, where the two main characters is a man and a woman, and they're showing their affection for each other. So just as Judaism is very much not just of a God who's a creator, but he's the God of history, and he very much loves you, and you are created in his image. So he's not detached, and no one has to die for our sins. And it's not like, he's some angry person in Christianity that he won't even look at you because you're such a sinner. It's really quite the opposite. He's absolutely madly in love with you. And the words Yishakeni, it's the opening of Song of Songs. Yishakeni minashikois pihu ki toivim deidechem. Kiss me with the kisses of thy lips, for thy love is better than wine, is outstanding. And the kissing is very important to that, because after all, that's how God conveyed his divine nature into man. Man is created in the image of God. There's a divine spark in every human being that's sacred. So we were created as humans through a kiss. And in our tradition, that's why people who love each other desperately want to kiss each other. Why? Because we want to I want to breathe you. I want to taste your essence. So that passage, which opens Song of Songs, is really, I think, very striking.
In reading the Pentateuch, I'll say this time, I noticed that Satan is never mentioned. Some people do say that the serpent in the Garden of Eden was Satan, but I don't see any evidence for that in the text itself. I'd like to know, what is the Jewish stance on Satan?
So Satan appears very rarely in the Hebrew Bible. It's most prominent in the book of Job. And this is very important. Satan is an angel that is created in order to give you free will and give all of us free will. Satan's job, first of all, he's not in rebellion against God. That's completely dualistic. That's a Christian idea that was borrowed from the pagan world. Satan does exactly what God wants him to do. However, you have free will. And because you're created in God's image, your default baseline is to do a good thing. You don't want to murder. You don't want to steal. You don't want to do these things because unlike your pet, unlike a cat or a dog, you're creating the image of God. Now, if we didn't have any evil inclination, if there was nothing casting forth any seductive blandishments, we would just never want to sin. Well, that sounds interesting. The only problem is that virtue would be then impossible. So therefore, God creates Satan, who does exactly what God wants him to do, and that is to tempt you, and then you really have complete free will. And that's why in Deuteronomy 30, we're told that the word Satan isn't used there, but God does say, before you I place life and good, evil and death, uvacharta v'chayim, choose life. So Isaiah 45, verse 7, I created evil. I created this because I want you to have free will. So Satan is there. He's very rarely mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. In every case, Satan is doing exactly what God tells him, instructs him to do. And Satan is considered in Judaism a blessing, because if we didn't have any evil inclination, then virtue would become impossible. And that wouldn't be an interesting world. So that's what Satan is. People can look at the serpent as Satan because it's the serpent is tempting Eve. It's a very intriguing story, but it's tempting Eve, and we're promised in Genesis chapter 4 that man can overcome these temptations. So the word is not used, but the idea does bleed through.
However, you brought up the book of Job, which that's why I limit it to the first 5 books, and Satan's not mentioned there, but the book of Job is another one that always confused me. The first time I read the Bible, I was around 15 or so, and the entire book of Job just put a giant exclamation point over my head. Again, I'll try to summarize the book for those who have not read it. Job, nice guy, loves God, got a wife, got a bunch of kids, he's got a farm, a ranch, successful fella. Satan tells God the only reason that he praises you as he does is because his life is so good, and if you take all that away, he will curse you. Isn't that kind of what happened? Wasn't Satan right?
Satan is doing what he's supposed to be doing. So Satan says to God that perhaps if his wealth and family were taken from him, perhaps he would not be as righteous as he is right now. And God sets the guidelines of what you can do. So you could take away his wealth and his family. You cannot take his life away from him. Job has a conundrum. So now he's suffering, and he's getting terrible advice from everyone. His wife is a total lunatic and tells him in verse 9 of chapter 2, why don't you just man up, curse God, and die? Very bad advice. He had friends. I mean, I'm sure in your life you've had friends that gave you very poor advice. We all have, of how to deal with whatever vicissitudes. So Job is getting all this advice from all sides. The key point is that even Job comes to the point where he curses the womb in which he was born. That means he wishes he was never born, but he never curses God, and he doesn't listen to the bad advice of his contemporaries. And then God restores back everything that's been taken from him. So Job is an example of what man can do, and that man can defeat the blandishments of Satan. And Job is a beautiful example of it, of how to deal with bad advice, how to deal with vicissitudes and suffering. But ultimately, Job wins at the end. He never curses God. His family is restored. His wealth is restored.
Were they restored? I thought he got a new family, a new wife, and new children, and new livestock, I suppose.
He gets back 10 children. He gets back a wife. So his family is restored.
I suppose good for Job. It's not all that good for all the people who are dead.
So it's presented as though there's a new wife and 10 new kids, and it's fine to read it that way. After all, life belongs to God. What's being conveyed is that everything is restored back to him. You know, his wealth is given back to many-fold of what he had, but the family is identical. And that's what leads you to view Job it should be seen as a historical figure. It's considered the oldest book in the Bible, the oldest book in the canon. It predates the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. There's no mention of the Sabbath or anything like that. And it's a book that tells us how to deal with suffering, what's good advice, what's bad advice. And the book of Job is very consumed with telling us how to be successful. In that he's restored back with the wife and the same number of children would lead us to believe that that everything was rectified in his life. His wealth was restored back to him manifold. So the message there is fairly transparent, that ultimately God makes the crooked way straight. Ultimately, all will be restored.
I'd like to thank Rabbi Tovia for speaking with me here today, and I shall do so now. Thank you, Rabbi.
No, I'm very grateful to spent this time with you. Judaism is just about God created the heavens and the earth, and a God of history who's deeply involved in our lives. And we need a lot of prayers from all of you. This is a challenging time for all of us. And I thank you very much for having me on your show. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Thank you. Shalom.
Shalom. In 1909, Christian anarchist Albert Hubbard wrote, "A genius is a man who can take lemons that fate hands him and start a lemonade stand with them." This was the first version of the proverb, "When life gives you lemons, make lemonade." I understand the sentiment, but life did not give us lemons. Lemons are not a naturally occurring fruit. About 4,000 years ago in Southeast Asia, humans crossbred the citron with the bitter orange, creating what is the modern lemon. So, life did not give you lemons. Humans did. Here's the thing, and it'll be done in a jiffy. Well, it'll take longer than a jiffy. A jiffy is a real unit of measurement. It's how long light takes to travel 1 centimeter in a vacuum. Just a dash of information for you. Actually, a dash is 1/8 of a teaspoon, although I'm not sure you can measure information that way. A pinch is 1/16 of a teaspoon, and a smidgen 1/32nd. And a thifto is a word I just invented. Thanks for watching, and may the road rise with you.